Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick update about Sony full-frame cameras. Now, the first thing I'll be talking about is the brand new firmware for the Sony A1. I will include a link in the description. That's version 1.1, and if you're curious what that update brings, even though I no longer have my review unit, I've got my A7R IV and my A7R II here and some glass that I just love using. Links will be in the description for all the gear you see here. Basically, what to expect out of this brand new firmware, pretty simple. Essentially, Sony aiming to address the top things that they have heard from consumers like many of you out there. So first and foremost, the EVF, the blackout issue associated with bright sunlight, basically causing the sensor to glitch out and forcing people to reboot. From what I've been reading and hearing, this brand new firmware update directly addresses that and essentially almost eliminates the problem. So that's fairly promising. Now remember, this firmware update has been live for less than 24 hours. So we'll see how that continues to flesh out, but that's still very important for any of you that were considering the A1, but the EVF, despite its resolution, field of view, and refresh rate, that issue was holding you back, which is completely understandable. The next issue, tracking. So subject tracking, there were some glitches, some bugs there, and that apparently has been, for the most part, also completely rectified. So that's pretty solid, if you ask me, and Sony moving quickly. After all, this is for a $6,500 body aimed at pros and consumers alike if you want the best that money can afford. And that's if you can find it in stock, because the A1 is still pretty much sold out everywhere. So even though there will be a link in the description, don't necessarily expect it to be there. I'll include Amazon and Best Buy. And then last but not least, eye autofocus, specifically with animals, which was one of the things that Sony was promising with the A1 line, was improved eye autofocus for birds, other animals, obviously pets, and that seems to be yet another thing that Sony targeted with this brand new firmware update. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention outside of that firmware update, again, linked below, is the discontinuation of the A7R IV. And a couple months ago, I did a video about the A7R IV and the A7R IVa coming out. The A7R IVa, essentially the exact same camera as the one I have here. Key difference being that the A7R IVa got a new USB-C port, a 3.2 port, and a higher resolution LCD screen. So moving from the typical display that most of us are accustomed to, a little over a million dot 3-inch panel, to a 2.3 million dot panel that omits the Sony branding, but otherwise an identical body. And also one of the trade-offs with the higher resolution display and of course that new USB port, but really more about the display, is battery life being a little bit less than what you're going to get out of the now discontinued A7R IV. Now, it's kind of jarring for me to even discuss a discontinuation of a camera like the A7R IV at this point in its lifespan, because traditionally, as I stated in my video 2 months ago, Sony really stays away from discontinuing any full-frame bodies until, quite frankly, the market no longer exists for them. Now, I get it. Sony has made some upgrades, and I guess I misjudged this play. I thought that this was, and it still may be in part what I presumed, but I really believed that Sony wasn't going to eliminate the A7R IV, but, you know, essentially just give us another option for anyone who is tempted to spend a few extra, it's really $500 extra on getting that improved display, because that's really, I think, the selling point of the new A model. But there's nothing really new about it, so I feel wrong even saying new A model, because I still would recommend the majority of you stick with the original A7R IV unless somehow they are exactly the same price, because then of course there's no logical reason not to take the newer A version. Now, when I said earlier that I got this wrong. What I obviously was pointing to was that I didn't think this would be discontinued, and I thought it was really a matter of a parts shortage. And it may very well still be exactly that, and that Sony decided to transition manufacturing, and as a result, the price that they had to take on for that higher res panel, which likely will become standard now in all new bodies, which I know stings for A1 users that don't have that higher resolution display on the back of the camera, that probably ends up equating to them passing along that cost. So maybe the truth of the matter here is that Sony was no longer interested in even seeing if they could source this older display, which meant it's easier to discontinue it in order to make sure that consumers are not confused or frustrated. And that's it. Say goodbye to the A7R IV. Say hello to the A7R IVa. Now, again, I think there are still going to be a lot of A7R IVs on the market. And if you are interested in purchasing, on the fence, trying to figure out whether or not the A7R IV is right for you, it's still an amazing camera. It's not going to give you the autofocus performance of an A9 or an A9 Mark II or an A1, or of course an A7S III, but it is still one of the best hybrids on the market, and I easily recommend it. It is still my favorite camera to shoot with. I mean, if I had an A1, obviously that would be my favorite, but I personally still think that that price on the A1 is going to come down, and I'll wait rather than be the early adopter, especially since I'm happy with my gear. I think that ultimately should drive the majority of our decisions. Of course, they're always your own, so I'm not really trying to influence it, more like just venting what I think is logical sense when it comes to making a purchase of any sort, but specifically, again, in the full frame mirrorless camera world. And right now, I cannot for any reason recommend that A7R IVa at its $3,500 retail price. Now, it is a bestseller on Amazon. If you click through on my link, you're going to see that. And you'll also see that the A7R IV is still there for sale for a hair under $3,000. And I do think it's the much better buy because, of course, if you really need a better display on this, get an external one. Granted, it's going to bulk things up, but depending on the type of work you're doing, professional or just enthusiast, this display really isn't necessarily going to cut it anyway. And that's what field monitors are all about. Now, on the flip side, as I said earlier, if they're the same price, it's a no-brainer. Do yourself a favor and get the A7R IVa. But clearly, Sony no longer interested in getting the older 1.4 million dot spec'd 3-inch panels. And as a result, it was easier to put the A7R IV to bed than continue to manufacture it. So I think it is clear that that panel is in tighter supply or just wasn't worth the investment. Or again, it's some marketing for Sony to introduce a pseudo, not a real new offering, but something that's a little bit different. I can't speak to how much faster the Type-C throughput is going to be, but what I can speak to is that gaining nearly 1 million extra dots on the display should be good. Now, should that be good enough? Would that lure me? Absolutely not. Would I welcome it? Of course, if the price is irrelevant. Now, when it comes to finding this used, I think this is going to be a blessing for anyone who's been waiting for the A7R IV, no differently than the A7R II. I mean, new this camera, the A7R II, is $1,200. I still don't think you can beat the performance it has to offer at that price point, both in still and video capability. Its autofocus system is more than competent, certainly isn't in the realm of this, which has 560 some odd phase points of hybrid, but phase points of detection in its autofocus system, which of course consists of phase and contrast, but it's still really competent, and I can't imagine any camera that I would pick over it for $1,200. With that said, if this is the route that the A7R IV is going to take, then you may want to wait a little bit, because if it somehow gets down to $2,000, it's pretty much, you're stealing the technology in this camera at that price. Bear in mind that the reason I thought the A7R IV would continue to live on was for the very simple reason that we've seen things like this happen before with the RX 100 line when they introduced the RX 100 5A. The RX 100 5 didn't get phased out initially. Eventually, it did fade into the sunset. So I guess it makes sense. But also, that was a cyber shot. So I didn't think that the cyber shot decisions would really enter into the same realm as what is being done with full frame mirrorless, simply because they're not in the same price range, obviously, sphere of photography in terms of types of tools. One is aimed at being a pocketable, prosumer point and shoot, which many people will say they'd rather use their phone, but no one's going to make that argument when it comes to full frame. And again, Sony's history of keeping bodies in the marketplace as long as consumers are still interested, and them serving eventually as just more budgetary options, I've always thought was smart. Instead of creating budget cameras, they allow their budget cameras to be their older cameras. And I think it's kind of brilliant, if you ask me. So, at any rate, the A7R IV is dead, at least in terms of future manufacturing. And again, even though I said Amazon has it in stock, if you go to B&H, if you go to Adorama, any of the typical camera authorized dealers, retailers, they will no longer have it for sale except in a used capacity. So if you want this new, now is the time. Amazon still has them. Again, links in the description. Otherwise, it's time to get ready to swallow the additional $500 US for that improved display and Type-C port. But that pretty much rounds it out. Again, version 1.1 for the A1 seems promising. Sony moving quickly to pacify and satisfy, and I think that's smart. It's also Sony's history of success here in the DI world, for anyone who thinks otherwise. And of course, the death of the A7R IV, sad, but I'll take the better battery life and lower res display, and the fact that I don't need to output any fresh money. And if you're wondering, again, we've got the G Master 100 to 400, the G Series 2 to 6. I've got the Viltrox Prime 24 f1.8, and then of course the A7R IV with Sony's pure digital shotgun mic, which is a must-have if you're doing any kind of run and gun interviews. It's just phenomenal for what it's able to do on battery power, no wires, and it pretty much covers anything that you need in a shotgun capacity. And then the tried and true F4 G Series 24 to 105, which is still one of my favorites, even though it's not optimal for the 61 megapixel beast inside of this camera. It still does an exceptional job, at least in the still realm. Video, also competent, so still highly recommend this, but these are my favorites right now, outside of course of my PZ Monster, which I'm not talking about in today's video. Hope you enjoyed. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.